lounging, son.
All right, welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name's Ryan, and with me today I have somebody that is very important to comics, somebody that has worn so many different hats. I'm so excited to kind of jump in and talk to you today. I'm talking to Diana Schutz. You have been a part of some of my favorite comics, some of my favorite comic companies, so I'm very excited to have you on today.
Cool. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, so it's kind of a little bit of a generic question, but I always like to ask this question because I think everybody's stories sometimes are different, than others. I always like to ask how you became a comics fan. What started your love for
it? I guess I have several different answers to that question, and it happened at different periods in my life. What got me started, one of the stories as a kid, is that my cousin Kenny, lately deceased, I'm sorry to say, was a huge Marvel fan. And his mother and my mother were sisters. They would get together, coffee clutch, and that was back in the days when non-working out of the house mothers would get together and spend time yakking over coffee and cigarettes for hours on end, and their children would get shoved off into a room. Back in the days when children were to be seen and not heard. And my cousin Kenny, who was a couple of years older than I was, gave me comics to read to keep me out of his 7-year-old hair. I was 5, and those comics were early 60s Marvels. So by the time I myself was 7 years old, I could art spot Steve Ditko before I even understood really that there were people making these things that I love so much. Anyway, pretty soon my own parents were buying comics for me to read, though they weren't the Marvels. They were the kinder, gentler DCs.
Which ones did you, obviously you said DC, but which comics did you kind of gravitate towards the most?
Well, as a young girl, Supergirl, of course, was my hero. She was 15 for one thing. So she was, she wasn't Wonder Woman, and she wasn't an adult. She was a teenager. So that was a little closer to something I could aspire to, I guess. She was blonde, and in those days I was a young blondie also. And she had the kind of, at that time, she was written by Otto Binder, who had also written Mary Marvel in the 40s and 50s. And Supergirl was a bit of an ingenue. She was Superman's secret weapon. He had not at that point introduced her to the world. So she lived in hiding, right? This is what happens. Your cousin comes, your only surviving cousin from a planet that's exploded, and she has superpowers like you. And what do? You shove her away into an orphanage and say, live there, and we're not going to tell anybody about you.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever. But when I was a little girl, that seemed all right. Well, you just accepted these things, so yeah, Supergirl went off into the orphanage, and she did things to help the other kids in the orphanage. Like she would use her super breath and clean up her room or their room in the puff of a super breath. And like for me, who would be instructed by my mom to clean my room, and that would take hours on end, the worst drudgery, this was a wonderful superpower to have. So I guess my point is that she wasn't out there saving the world necessarily like her super cousin, but she was doing smaller things that as a little girl I could relate to, I could grab onto, I suppose. So it's important for us to remember when we make comics that they're speaking to different peoples at different times, different age groups, and they have things to say that we as adults making them or critiquing them might not get anymore, you know.
Yeah, I definitely can relate, because I know that there's comics that I read when I first started I got into comics. I was 5 also, and yeah, I go back and read them, and I definitely like, especially like being a parent, you know, if there was something with like kids, like I didn't really get it back then, but now like, you know, I relate to it in a different way, and even stuff like maybe 10 years ago, like to now, like I can relate to it. So I definitely agree with what you said with that. I want to jump ahead real quick because I don't want to forget this in our conversation, but you got a chance to write Supergirl with one of my favorite artists, who also, you know, he passed this past year, and Tim Sale. What was that experience like? And also, if you could maybe share a Tim Sale story, because I know you've worked with him multiple times.
You know, Tim Sale, back in, I want to say it was 1987, people I think became familiar with Tim when he and Jeff Loeb began working together. The Long Halloween, I think, was their first Batman gig. Anyway, but my relationship with Tim goes back much further than that. He showed up on my desk in a pile of submissions. This was 1987. So I was, in those years, I was at Comico, where we published Mage and Grendel and Elementals and Robotech, Johnny Quest. Anyway, the bane of every editor's existence is the pile of submissions that's inevitably on her desk. And you're lucky if you have time on the weekend to go through that stuff, because you sure don't have time during the day to do it, you know. And I tell people it's the worst way to get into comics, to send stuff cold to a publishing company. That said, that's how Tim Sale got into comics, because his sample showed up on my desk in 1987, and I had a pile of crap that I was looking through, and suddenly there were these gorgeous pages where clearly the artist was not afraid to use ink to cover up the pages with black, you know. So that was, I mean, I was immediately taken with his art, and called up Matt Wagner, creator of Grendel, and said, hey, let's get this guy, let's put him on Grendel. And we did. So yeah. And then we met Tim, I guess, the following summer in San Diego, and became immediate. I mean, Tim was adopted into our family, sort of. He and Matt certainly became best bros. And and Tim and I continued. I mean, I didn't just put him on Grendel. We did more work together before Jeff Loeb came around. In fact, we did quite a lot of work together. And anytime, I'm not, you know, I never wanted to be a writer of comics, but there were a couple stories I had to tell, I was interested in telling. And when I had those stories to tell, Tim was the person I wanted to draw those stories. And then he, to get back to your original question, he turned the tables on me when the first issue of Solo was in planning, which was a comic series published by DC that featured a different artist every issue. And in every issue, that artist would draw stories written by a variety of people. So the first issue of Solo was the Tim Sale issue. And much to my surprise, in addition to asking Jeff Loeb to write him a story and Darwin Cook to write him a story, he also asked me. And, you know, yeah, so I did. He asked me originally to write him a romance story. He knew that I'm a huge fan of romance, old romance comics. And but then I learned that this was going to be owned by DC, that Solo would be not a creator-owned project, but a DC-owned project. So I thought, well, if what I write is, if I'm going to have to sign a work for hire contract anyways, then let me play with some of DC's toys. And particularly, yeah, let me play with Supergirl. And so I wrote him the romance story that he asked for, but I made it a Supergirl story. And it was a sad romance story too.
Yeah, I just think it's such a cool story to go from like that's what you were reading like when you were young, and then you got a chance to finally do it with, in my opinion, one of the best cartoonists that's ever lived. So I just wanted to ask that before
I'm lucky. Let me just turn this around if I can and show you, if I'm able to. Tell me what you see, because I don't know if you can see it.
You got the original art there.
Yes, from Tim's.
Yes.
Tim's Supergirl. And then next to it is Jim Mooney's Supergirl from the 1960s. And at the far end, I have Frank Miller's Supergirl from the cover of the Supergirl Archives book that DC published. So,
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So yes, big Supergirl fan.
Well, that's so awesome. I love seeing that. I definitely need to up my original art in my collection. It's something that I really want to get into, but
it's these days it's not
as easy as it was.
No, it's not. And I have to say I've been lucky because a lot of, for instance, that Supergirl page was a gift from Tim. And so yeah, it's, if I were to go out there and start purchasing some of what I have now, I couldn't afford it. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. Very expensive.
So let's now I want to jump back a little bit, and like you decide like this is a career path for you. You started on the retail side of it,
I did.
I believe, right?
Yes.
So what was that experience like, and was that kind of the spot you kind of thought that, okay, I'll start here and then I can segue into further, or was it just something that kind of happened organically?
I was in a PhD program studying philosophy at the University of British Columbia, and I was feeling more and more alienated from the world, and had kind of rediscovered comics. Not that I had ever really left them, but let's just say I'd gotten serious about comics again when I was in university, and I started collecting them and learning about what had happened while I'd been busy being a teenager and discovering boys and alcohol and, having parties. So, during the week, I was reading like Bertrand Russell and Plato and Immanuel Kant. And on the weekend, I was reading Jack Kirby. And there seemed to me a kind of balance there or something. There was, I don't know, there was the kind of profundity that I was wanting in the philosophy courses that I was taking. I was also getting out of Lee and Kirby, but in a different way, anyway, school was, it was just getting to be too removed from the world, I guess. And all I had ever done at that point, I was 23, all I had ever done had been to be a student. I'd done nothing else. And finally I decided I need to get out of there. And I was the only female customer at the store that I shopped at. The direct market had just come into existence. Prior to that, I'd been finding comics in the back of secondhand bookstores, but there were no such things as comic book stores. But in the mid-70s, they began to grow everywhere, organically almost. And so the store that I shopped at offered me a job. And I said yes. And I dropped out of school and I went to work for them. And I started on their 4th anniversary. So that was 1978. They'd opened in 74. I'd found them in 75. And it was my first education in comics. Nowadays, we have, like at Portland State University, we have the comic studies program, and you can go to school and learn about comics. But in those days, you could not. And the then owners of the comic shop, 2 guys named Ron Norton and Ken Witcher, began to teach me everything, a fangirl's dream. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know, the more I wanted to be involved with what was going on. And so, yeah, I mean, it wasn't that I set out to work at the comic shop with the idea that eventually I would get into publishing. It was that as I fell into this, in fact, Ken Witcher told me, maybe even my first day on the job, he said, "We're going to change your life." And they did, man. They really did. The more they taught me, the more I wanted to know. And so as I fell into this, I guess it kind of organically became a career path. It wasn't predetermined, but I sure knew after, a few years that this is where I was heading.
Yeah, I think even myself, and especially people reading comics now, take for granted that there wasn't always a store or they could get their comics. I mean, I didn't go to like, that's not how I got my comics either in the beginning. I mean, I think I got at newsstands, grocery stores, like they were they were very prominent. Yeah, when I was a kid, like I didn't know, like, until I like really got into it, maybe like age 9 is when I entered a comic book store, and it wasn't even like your regular comic store. It was a record store called Green Hell, and they had like a bunch of vinyls, and then they had a comic section, but it was like a bunch of sci-fi stuff. Also, just like a really not your typical comic book store that you
was that in LA, or was it was in LA?
Yeah, it was in Sherman Oaks. It was off of Ventura and Van Nuys is where it was.
Because LA actually had one of the very first comics. It was sort of I guess a collector's or a magazine collector's shop, and they were carrying comics. I forget the name of it right now. I'm sorry. But they were open 1968. So that was early. And by the mid 70s, I want to say there would have been quite a few shops, but LA is so huge. I mean, if you're a kid, you're restricted to kind of your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like, even just in my time of being a fan, like you see them open and close, the ones that stand the test of time. I think it's, just since I've been collecting, the stores I've had pulls at, have kept closed, like a lot. But it is something that I think is so important to comics. And I think, like I said, people take it for granted. Like, you're going in for an experience when you walk into the shop. It's not like you're going on Amazon and you're clicking buy. There's nobody talking to you. There's nobody that hypes up a book. And I think it is like myself working at one. I was working full time. I'm only there Wednesday, New Comic Book Days, the shift I wanted to keep. But yeah, I think comic book stores are they're amazing, and like you said, you got like a crash course in comics. Like that's what I love about it, is that, turning people onto stuff is
and it's instant community. I really felt like with the I had great friends in the philosophy department at University of British Columbia. But once I had the job at the comic shop, I really felt like I had found my tribe of people, you know, and really never looked back after that. You know, these were the people I wanted to be with. These were the things I cared about, that I wanted to know more about and wanted to ultimately become a part of. So, and yeah, because before I found the comic shop in Vancouver, BC, like I say, I would, to find comics, we'd go to secondhand bookstores, and there might be a box of comics in the back, and there would be no rhyme or reason to the way they were stacked or stored, and you'd have to go through everything. Mind you, you know, in those days, you could really come up with like early Fantastic Four, some real treasures for a nickel, you know, but because nobody cared or nobody knew, and it was too early for the serious, or the collector's market was really just beginning at that point, I guess. Of course, the first thing I learned when I went to work at the comic book store was to, you know, bag and tag old comics. And, you know, the minute a comic was a day old, it was an old comic
Yeah.
with a higher price on it, you know. Because in the early days of comics retail, of course, the collector's market was the big thing. You could now go somewhere where if you were looking for Spider-Man issue number 87, you could go into a Spider-Man pile and go through the issues and go through the numbers till you got to 87. And this was such a, like a miracle to those of us who had grown up buying from the newsstand, where there was no way to keep continuity at all, you know. So yeah, the comic stores really, when they came into existence, they made a real sea change in the industry, and for those of us who were reading the books and collecting them.
Definitely agree.
Yeah.
I mean, even like I said, like if I look through my stuff that I got as a kid, like you can see like there's a gap sometimes in between issues because I wasn't going to a shop, you know.
Right. Right.
And you worked on a zine called The Telegraph Wire. That was during your time at the shop?
I left Vancouver, BC, and with sort of no prospects. I'd gone back to Montreal, where my family lived, for a long story. No need to get into it. And I didn't really know what I was going to be doing, and so I arbitrarily wrote to. I had, in '78, I had been to Berkeley, California, for a philosophy conference, and I'd been back in early '81, and this was the fall of '81, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And so I wrote to Bud Plant, who at the time was a co-owner of a retail chain in the Northern California Bay Area, and a chain called Comics and Comics. And I wrote to Bud and said, look, Yadata, I have 3 years of experience working in comics retail. I know how to bag and tag. I even know how to grade a comic. You know, I know how to purchase them and grade them and price them and all those kinds of things. And why don't you hire me? And Bud, who's still, Bud Plant Collectibles, still in business today, Bud passed on my letter to his partner, John Barrett, co-owner of the 7-store Comics and Comics chain. And John hired me. So I moved to Berkeley, and went to work there. And within 3 months, I started like a retailer magazine called The Telegraph Wire. And within a year, that became my sole job. It turned into, a bi-monthly magazine, basically, that ran 24 to 32 pages every 2 months. And I did everything for, chief cook and bottle washer, man. The reviews, the interviews, I solicited ads, I typed everything up because this was pre-computer. So everything was done on a typewriter and pasted up columns of type onto what are called mechanicals, and dealt with the printer. I mean, it was a crash course in production and printing and editing. And I was helped along by some dear friends in the Bay Area, the most important of whom was Tom Orzechowski, who, when we met at Comics and Comics, I was at the cash register and he was buying comics, and he introduced himself. And I said, I know who you are. And he said, oh, come on, I'm just a letterer. And I was like, yeah, just a letterer for the best-selling comic of now, the 80s, which of course was X-Men, Claremont and Burns X-Men. So Tom had worked in production at Marvel, and I told him what I wanted to do with this magazine, and he helped me out. He taught me a lot. So it really, Ryan, it's been this series of people who adopted me throughout my career and taught me what I needed to know, because again, in those days, you couldn't go to school and learn somewhere how to do this stuff. So
yeah, I love hearing stories like this. It's just cool how just like the sequence of events just keep leading you to something else. How did you land with Comico, where you were editor-in-chief?
I came in, yeah, that's very simple. I came in on Bob Schreck's coattails. And Bob and I were then an item, and I had left Berkeley. I'd moved to New York. We'd had this long distance relationship, New York to Berkeley. And in those days, without cell phones, without email, it was crazy and it was expensive. And finally, one of us had to move. So I moved to New York, and immediately, thanks to both Chris Claremont, whom I'd met through Tom Orzechowski, and Frank Miller, whom I'd met through working in comics, through having written him letters to Daredevil. Anyway, through the two of them, I was immediately offered a job at Marvel. I lasted 4 days at Marvel. I couldn't stand it. It was not for me. It was supposed to be the pie in the sky, the job of my dreams. And 4 days later, I quit. So I didn't know what I was going to do. But then Bob was hired at Comico, and I basically made myself indispensable to them. And so they hired me too. But it was you have to imagine, I had been working for these very small companies. We were all in those years, comics were becoming very political. We were campaigning for creators' rights. Publishers weren't returning artwork to creators in those years. Creators couldn't own characters or stories that they'd done. And so we were, the Comics Journal had just come into being. Comics journalism was just beginning. We were all fighting for what we believed was right and important. And I thought I would go to work at Marvel, assistant editor on the X-Men, and I would change things from within. And I got to Marvel, and it was a Midtown Manhattan corporation. And I never got the sense that anybody cared about any of what was fueling me in
Mhm.
terms of my passion for comics and for making the industry a better place for creators. Whereas at Comico, they were a tiny little company owned by a couple of guys who really didn't know what they were doing, but they hired Bob and then they hired me, and they kind of let us do some things that we thought were really important. So yeah, it was, and then, you know, subsequently, the job at Dark Horse, Mike Richardson hired Bob, and Bob said, well, you have to take my wife too. and Mike didn't really know my work at all. You know, he knew Bob from Comico, but he didn't know me. And he's very tall. I wasn't really on his radar, you know. So anyway, he hired me, and 6 months later, he pulled me aside and said, well, you really know what you're doing as an editor. Well, yeah, I've been doing this now for a while. You just hadn't noticed, you know. But so yeah, I mean, comics in those years, there just weren't very many women working in the industry, and I'm not sure, to be really brutally honest, I'm not sure I would have gotten those jobs without Bob. I wouldn't have gotten the job offer at Marvel without Frank and Chris campaigning for me. And yeah, I wouldn't have been offered work at Comico or at Dark Horse without Bob. So.
Well, thank God for Bob, because you helped bring in, like I said, you helped usher in so much greatness in comics and stuff I associate with. I mean, you also hired one of my favorite editors. At the time, she was Shelley Roberg. Now she's Shelley Bond, and she speaks very highly of you as well. So, you know, I'm just so glad that all these opportunities lined up, and well-deserved opportunities as well. You know, in '99 at Dark Horse, you started the Maverick imprint too. So you also, like, a lot of different, like, some of my favorite creators fell under that umbrella for a while. What was the impetus behind starting that imprint within Dark Horse?
It was, I wanted to save Frank. Bob had left Dark Horse, and Mike Richardson was getting pretty busy with Hollywood. And the publishing company was a bit rudderless at the time, mid-90s. And Bob left Dark Horse in a bit of a huff and went off to form Oni Press. So Frank was left without an editor, because Bob had been his editor, and called me and said, well, you know, how about it? And I was pretty wary of that, because Frank and I had been friends for a long time. We'd been friends since before Dark Horse had even existed, you know. We'd met in 1981 in Berkeley. And I was wary of ruining our friendship, I guess, if I had to become his editor and tell him things maybe he didn't want to hear. So Frank proposed, well, let's give it 6 months and see how it goes. And as it turned out, it worked out pretty well, since I was his editor for 17 or 18 years there. What happened was Frank was getting the sort of the monthly bundles of comics from Dark Horse. So Frank was seeing everything we were publishing. And by the middle and 90s, Dark Horse was really, people thought of us as the licensing company, you know, Aliens, Star Wars, Predator, whatever. And it's true that Dark Horse had gone out of its way to get those licenses. As a company, unlike Marvel or DC, Dark Horse didn't own its own line of superheroes. And And while we published a lot of creator-owned stuff, Mike Richardson had worked hard to get various licenses, starting with Aliens, and then I think it was by the mid-90s we got Star Wars, you know, the mother lode of all licenses, certainly at that time for Dark Horse. And Frank was getting the monthly bundle of comics published by Dark Horse, and he called me one day and he said, you know, I've just looked at everything you guys published this month, and I don't see how Sin City fits with this. You know, it's all licensed stuff. And Frank had come to Dark Horse on a platform of creators' rights. I mean, people forget now, it was so long ago, or they don't know, but when Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons brought Martha Washington, Give Me Liberty, to Dark Horse Comics, that was jaw-dropping in the industry, because, you know, Dave was fresh off Watchmen, Frank was fresh off Dark Knight Returns, and all of a sudden, a couple years go by where neither of them does any comics at all, and then suddenly they're taking their character to this tiny little company, Dark Horse Comics, that had been in existence at that point only 3 years, couldn't get a comic book out on time to save their lives, and were where in Oregon, where, you know, and so it was just, it shook up the whole industry that Frank and Dave would do this. But they were adamant that they were going to work on IP that they owned. They were not going to give it away as they had been doing for years. And so that was a huge, you know, it was a huge shift for Dark Horse. And then followed that up with licensed properties, another huge shift for Dark Horse, and the money started to come in. And I went in 6 months after Frank and Dave had brought Give Me Liberty to Dark Horse, and I started, I was managing editor, which meant I began taking care of all the scheduling, and I got all the trains to run on time. They hadn't been able to get books out on time before then. They were working with a bad printer. They didn't know how to make production schedules. They didn't know stuff that I did. Mm-hmm. And I went in and put all these schedules into place for them. So the company had expanded, and Frank is looking at the monthly bundle in '99 and says, I don't see where I fit anymore. Where are all the creator-owned books? It's all this licensed stuff. And so he and I got to talking and decided that, you know, maybe it would be a good idea, because I said, no, we're still publishing lots of creator-owned stuff. It's just people don't see us that way anymore, because Star Wars is getting all the radio play, you know. That's what people are noticing. So maybe it would be a good idea to lump all the creator-owned stuff together and say, here, no, this was Dark Horse's foundation. We're still publishing this stuff. So it was Frank who came up with the name, and it was a discussion with him that led this imprint to happen. But unfortunately, it never got much support from the marketing department. I mean, a little bit, you know, but marketing is all about whatever the next big flashy thing is. So there was an initial burst of support for Maverick, and then marketing had to move on to something else, because that's what marketing does. Yeah, I don't know. It was an idea that was a little ahead of its time, I think. We wanted to do graphic novels, and that it was just a little too soon. I think maybe 5 years later, it might have gotten more support.
Yeah. I think it's interesting though, because like obviously, yeah, Star Wars is a huge license, and I think that you kind of see it a little bit with, I mean, with IDW now. You know, they became known as like the licensed publisher,
Right.
and I know that they're losing some, so now they're kind of repurposing and trying to get more creator own stuff, which is what I kind of saw with Dark Horse post losing Star Wars and
Right.
Aliens and all that stuff, and you see like more of an influx of creator own titles again, which is what I like the most too. You know, I love seeing that stuff. But yeah, I think it's the industry, especially you're talking 99, like I mean, you have the speculator boom too, that I'm sure played a huge factor in on the publishing line. As an editor and like a curator of the line of books that you're doing, what was it like navigating through that time of the speculator boom, and how did it kind of affect your day-to-day?
Well, you know, we were really just all trying to hang on as we watched retailers give in to greed, publishers give in to greed. I see now, I mean, I look through the Diamond catalog, and every single publisher, Dark Horse included, you know, offers like 10,000 different covers of one issue of a comic. And I just don't know how that's sustainable, Ryan, you know? I don't believe we have that many buyers out there in the market. And well, it's worrisome because that was exactly the kind of thing that I saw back in the 90s. Yeah, people were going into retailer, a lot of trading card dealers who didn't know anything about comics, and they were suddenly becoming comic shop retailers, and publishers were playing into all of that with multiple covers and whatever holographic covers and all sorts of, you know, ploys to separate kind of the idiot from his dollar, I guess. And well, it just, yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm naive because I think that in the end, good will out. And if you just make the right books and make the important books, people will buy them. And I'd like to believe that's true, but it's only partly true. We've seen that 1,000 times through the years, you know. So so how did we navigate? Luckily, I mean, I didn't have to make those decisions. Dark Horse wasn't my company. It was owned by one guy, Mike Richardson, and there were a few Black Fridays during that time where half the employees were slashed. You know, just all of a sudden, the person in the office next to you was gone, and they would do it in a big, like it wasn't just a trickle away of employees. It would be a big loss, and those were tough times. Mike was fortunate because he loved the comics. He loved the publishing so much. He often funneled the movie money he was making into the publishing company. Oh, wow. So he kept us alive lots of times when other publishers were suffering as a result of what was going on in the market. The decision to, you know, Marvel also in 94, when they elected to go with Heroes World,
their own distribution company.
Yes, their own distribution company. And Heroes World wasn't set up to be a national distribution house. They were a regional company. they weren't able to service the whole country, and that that ultimately led to Marvel's filing for bankruptcy 2 years later. And that also led to, with Heroes World basically going belly up, we were left with two distribution houses. One was Capital City, the other was Diamond. And Diamond very aggressively worked to push Capital City out and to become a monopoly, which it was up until just a few years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are not healthy business practices.
Yeah.
They're just not. And so, yeah, I mean, you kind of, you watch everything sort of going to flames around you, and you just do what you can to hang on, I guess. Dark Horse did a lot of things to hang in there, and has managed 30, almost 40 years later now to still be in the game, but yeah, there were some hard times, losing employees, hiring freezes, raise freezes, for instance.
Yeah.
All the things that you do when you're just trying to tough out a difficult period, I guess.
Yeah, I only asked that because there's so many similarities happening, right now, like there were in the 90s. The only difference is there's no Wizard magazine that's feeding the speculator boom. There's just
right, another, yeah.
There's just apps called Key Collector, that's pumping, oh, this is the new hot book, you need to go buy this, or like, even me, like the variant covers, like I will, and I'm pretty sure my boss won't listen to this, but I will talk people out of buying the variant cover. I'm like, why don't you just get another book? Why are you buying multiple copies of the same book? Like, go try this out. Go support a smaller title so that those titles will continue to exist instead of buying 7 Batman comics. DC will be okay, if you don't buy all these.
Right.
But it's so interesting to me, and I'm looking forward to like this wave ending and then getting into some new territory and seeing kind of what comes out of this, because like even the pandemic, that was, I know, like just being at the shop like that, it was a scary time for retailers, a scary time for the creators, the publishers, all that stuff, and the fact that everybody was able to come out of that, and survive that, and kind of be in a little bit, in some instances, a little bit of a better place. Not everybody, but I just love this industry so much. This is what I'm passionate about, is comic books. I love them. It's my favorite medium on the planet. There's things you can do in comics you can't do anywhere else. So
that's absolutely correct. Yeah. And the pandemic, you're right, it hurt people, but by the same token, as we got used to being in lockdown or whatever, what do you do when you're stuck at home all the time? And you read, you read. And so many publishers actually made money during the pandemic and continued to hang on to those readers once we began to normalize a little more, so in some ways and collectors had more time to devote to looking for, even if they were just looking online, to looking for that piece that they needed to fill their run of whatever it is. And so, what I've heard, I think retailers being the front line, they were in the scariest position. But from everything I've heard, comics as a whole, if we are on the other side of the pandemic now, which is still in question, I guess, but things have begun to normalize. And what I am given to understand is that comics are about as healthy as they've ever been. So, you know, it's like the Depression, people went to movies. I mean, you know, we
Yeah.
need, when the world is going to hell in a handbasket, we need our entertainment, you know, we need to forget that the world is going to hell. And so what little money we have, we put towards keeping ourselves entertained. And I think comics seem to have done fairly well as a result. So,
Yeah. And I hope they continue to do well, you know.
mhm.
So you retired from Dark Horse in 2015. I know that the past few years, I don't know if it even overlapped with that though. I know you teach, and I know you've been translating a lot of books. Like Black Sad recently came, I think maybe I'm probably wrong, maybe like 3 months ago, I think the new one came out.
Last summer, but yeah,
Oh, last one. Okay.
yeah,
Time
I know,
time
right?
goes by crazy. I didn't realize it's been that long. So can you talk a little bit about like your decision to get into teaching, and in turn like also continuing while being retired to like translate some of these awesome comics?
Yeah, and I should say, first of all, I retired in quotes. I left staff at Dark Horse, and my plan was never to stop working because I love comics. I'm not, you know, I love comics. I love to work. Um, but I wanted to leave staff. Um, the editorial department at that time was under the control of someone who was not doing a good job for a variety of reasons, who is now no longer with the company. And in fact, the editor-in-chief is my former assistant, Dave Marshall, who is an angel. But in 2015, I'd had about enough of our then editor-in-chief as I could manage. Um, and uh, and I wanted to get out from under that very poor management, and I wanted to stop working 60 hours a week, because that's about what I was
Oh,
putting
wow.
in. Yeah. And do some other, try my hand at some other things. Yeah. I'd been teaching since 2002, you know, part-time, one course a year. And I wanted to ramp that up a little. Dr. Susan Kirtley had just, in 2014, she had worked her butt off to get a comic studies program established at Portland State University. And I wanted to help her grow that program. And so, I did all those things. I also began translating, yes, which I found is a huge, huge joy. Um, I love that. I'd do more of that if I could. Um, and I continued to do some editing on a freelance basis. So yeah, I probably should never have said I was retiring, but I didn't want to create bad blood. And the person who was still running the editorial department at that time, I mean, was there, and I didn't, it just felt easier to say I'm retiring. I was certainly old enough to retire. And so, so that's how it all happened. But yeah, I just wanted to expand sort of the scope of what I was doing.
Mhm.
And the comic studies program is great. Portland State University has a program, and the University of Oregon, which is in Eugene, Oregon, about 2 hours south of here, also has a comic studies program. So Oregon is doing very well when it comes to that. San Francisco State has a comic studies program. These programs, you know, they began as isolated courses. When I first started teaching comics in 2002 here in Portland, I was the only game in town, you know, and it was just this one isolated course that I taught at the local community college once a year. But then some years later, Ben Saunders came to me. Ben was teaching at the University of Oregon. He wanted to set up an entire program there, and he knew I was teaching. So we started getting together to talk about that on a regular basis. Susan Kirtley, I met her also, and I was really, really pushing to get academic stuff happening in comics anywhere I possibly could. But until about 5 to 10 years ago, it really was, there were just sort of a handful of us teaching individual courses here, there, and everywhere. There was nothing really organized, and now more and more universities are hosting entire programs around comics, which is great. You can go to school right now. Portland residents can go to school and learn about comics history from Douglas Wolk, who just wrote that
All the
fantastic,
Marvels.
yes, all the Marvels,
Yeah.
where he had to read 25,000 Marvel comics to write that book. Anyway, Douglas is teaching comics history. He's a great, I audited his history course about a year ago, and it was fantastic. He's just great. You mentioned Shelley. Last spring, I taught the first ever anywhere, anytime university accredited course in comics editing at Portland State. And I've decided that after 20 years of teaching, I've had my fill, and I recommended that Portland State hire Shelley to take over that course. And so Shelley will be teaching comics editing there this spring, which is awesome. Can't think of a better person to do that. Shelley she was a guest speaker in my editing course last spring, and she's just so on top of everything, man. She's so good.
Yeah.
So and the students are going to love her. She's so hip as well, so it'll be, she'll be, and she's doing that all via Zoom. So, you don't have to live anywhere anymore to do your thing. It's great.
Yeah,
So.
that's awesome. I mean, it kind of I've long wanted to get out of California and move to Oregon, and that's like one of the things that I love about both of those schools, that they have comics courses, so I think Portland has just become such a comics town, and it's so cool to kind of like, that's kind of like where I want to be a part of, like, the hustle and bustle of LA is just, it's just not for me anymore. But I definitely got to look into that class with Shelley Bond. I know she's doing another Zoom thing that she's got in February, but it's always on Saturdays, and I work.
Oh,
so.
yeah.
But
well, Shelley taught she taught an editing course, but not she taught it as adult education, so it's not a university credit,
Right.
But what she's doing in the spring will be, if you're getting your degree, if you're working towards a degree, or if you're working towards, like Portland State offers a comic studies certificate, which we hope eventually to turn into a master's degree. By taking Shelley's course, you get credit, you get university credit that you can put towards any degree, really. So Shelley has her own thing that she offers, which is, again, adult education. And I know she's going to take components of that and put it towards the university course, but universities have their own requirements, I guess. Yeah. So,
all right, cool. I'll definitely be on the lookout for that.
Yeah. And we have also like Brian Bendis and David Walker teaching writing comics at Portland State. Portland really is a mecca. And when Mike Richardson moved Bob Schreck and me here to Portland in 1990, it was not that way at all. It was, New York was still the home of Marvel and DC Comics. New York was still the comic book hub. And but as Dark Horse grew, and then Bob left to form Oni, and Oni Press grew, and then Jim Valentino, my old friend, called me up one day and said, I'm tired of Southern California and I want to move to Portland, and will you show me around the place? And so then Jimmy moved up here, and a few years later, all of Image, Image Central moved to Portland. So yeah, with 3 sort of major publishers here, yes, and rent used to be cheap, not so much anymore, I'm sorry. But the comics community just grew and grew and grew. And now with the educational programs, it really does feel like Portland is a huge hub of comics. Yeah.
That's where I want to move to. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been talking about it for you. I visited one time, and I'm like, why am I not living here? It was like we went on vacation a few years ago, and I'm just like, this is way better than where we are now. But someday I do find to make the move.
8 months of rain, Ryan.
I'm cool with the rain. I don't. I mean, it's overcast right now here, and it makes me happy. So I don't need the sun. I don't need the sun. Before we kind of wrap it up, though, I just want to ask a couple more questions. I want to ask, and it's kind of a 2-part question. It's what's the most significant change that you've seen in the industry in your career, and then in turn, what do you think, or what do you see needing to happen to continue to grow as an industry?
Oh boy. Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, and I'd be a lot richer if I did. Let me take the first question first, because it's much easier. The biggest change was for sure the computer, was the transition to digital, because when I started publishing comics, when I became an editor of comics, we were still working in a film environment. And that was very restrictive in a lot of ways. There were, the reason you see so many reprints of great comics nowadays is because the technology allows us to do that sort of stuff that we could not do 20 years ago, yeah, comics used to be printed just like old photos used to be printed from film negatives. Comics used to be printed from film negatives. So the process of making them and preparing them for printer was entirely different than it is now. And that has for sure been the biggest change, largely because it's allowed us to do so much more by going from actual tangible negative film files to digital files for printing. That's opened up a universe of stuff for us to be able to publish stuff from years. I mean, I think of the beautiful reprints that Dean Mullaney is doing, Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff, stuff from the 1930s. That Fantagraphics is doing with the George Harriman Crazy Cat and Elsie Segar Popeyes, all that stuff, which some of it had been reprinted before, but it was reprinted using film technology and photocopy technology. And if you look at what they were able to produce 20, 30 years ago versus what's being produced right now, you can just compare the quality of the image, and it's so much better now. So yeah, that shift to digital made for some tremendous changes in in publishing. And so yeah, that would be that. As for what we need to do to stay alive, I don't know. Again, I'll go back to naive me and say, just keep publishing the right work and treating your creators fairly, treating your employees fairly. I like to believe that if we make the sort of work environment a good place for everyone, then we'll produce the best work. That might just be way too naive, but then I look at companies like Fantagraphics that are still taking chances, Drawn and Quarterly the same, taking chances and doing interesting work that pushes the medium. Even Dark Horse is still, though Dark Horse is more of a commercial company than that, but they still are producing work that that's interesting, that's not just designed to make $1,
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to see more European work brought in. The translation work that I've been doing is really exciting, and there's so much, the idea of multicultural reading is promoted by bringing in work from other countries, and people having a different approach to the language of comics. You see it when you read manga, different visual tropes mean different visual things in different cultures, and we can just learn so much from what other cultures have to offer. So I don't know. Yeah, it's all probably very naive, because in the end, the big corporate 1% is going to take over everything, and we're all going to be screwed. I don't know.
Well, I love that you mentioned like Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly. They're two companies that I've discovered over the past few years. Not discovered, I heard of them, but I never really read stuff by them. But it's really expanded the types of comics that I'm consuming. Yes, I've always read indie stuff, but maybe not to that level. So, and I that's what, like I said earlier, that's what's great about comics, is there really is a comic book for all types of readers.
Yes,
I can find a comic book for everybody. Now, I may not necessarily be able to get them to read the book. Like my wife won't necessarily read the books I tell her she like, but I know that if she were to read it, she'd like it. And then, in the comic shops too, getting people to kind of step out of their comfort zone. I think that there's just so much good stuff being published, and I hope it continues. And I just wish nothing but the best for those publishers that are not the big two, as they call them, to continue to thrive.
There is a wealth of riches out there. I mean, I can't begin to explain the difference. When I was 20, and what I had available to buy was published either by Marvel or by DC. I'd outgrown Archie Comics, and so those were my choices, period. And with the advent of independent publishers in the late 70s, and as more and more people were able to come into the industry with different ideas and different approaches, I mean, look at where we are today. There is so much being published, and so much of it is great, and not just retread month after month stuff, though there's that too, and it serves a purpose as well. I mean, I'd read, if I were incredibly wealthy, I'd read a lot more as it is, though. I mean, there's so much more for me as a 68-year-old woman. There is so much more for me to read now than there was when I was a 20-year-old girl. So it's really, we're living in some very good times. I think the industry really has grown so much, and we're blessed in a lot of ways.
Mhm. I definitely agree. Before I let you go, is there anything that you're currently working on that you want to plug and let everybody know?
Well, I would say there is the Black Sad translation, which came out, which was published last August. Black Sad, They All Fall Down is part one of a two-part storyline, and this is by two Spanish creators. Juan Diaz Canales is the writer, and Juanjo Guarnido is the artist. And the book is set in 1950s America and features a very cool cat, John Blacksad, as the detective, the hero, Private Eye. And they're beautifully drawn, they're beautifully written, and it's been a real honor to be involved with the translation. And I was called back as the book's editor as well. They asked me to come back and edit, so I'm doing that on a freelance basis. And part two is in process, so I'm not sure when it will be published in English. Probably not before next year sometime, but that's Black Sad is it for now. So
Okay.
please, yeah.
Definitely go check it out. Those books are amazing. And like you said, they are very, very beautiful. The artwork is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you again so much. If you're up for it, I'm definitely down to maybe do this again with you sometime. I'd really love to kind of like maybe some questions that haven't come to my head while we were talking that I'd love to unpack with you again.
Sure, anytime, Ryan.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm going to drop down the link below where people can pick up the Black Sad book, where they can find you online. And again, thank you so much. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Nice to do this.